Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Theophrastus's book, Characters. So Theophrastus was an ancient Greek philosopher. He was born at Erissos on the island of Lesbos around 372, 371, 370, somewhere in there. And he was a disciple of Aristotle. And the Characters definitely reflects that Aristotelian approach, because one of Aristotle's great passions was categorizing things. And that's really what the Characters does. Theophrastus was a major player in Aristotle's Lyceum, which was the school of philosophy that Aristotle founded. And actually, when Aristotle died in 322, 321, Theophrastus took over the Lyceum. He became the leader of this school. Now, The Characters is an interesting book, in part because it's not entirely clear that it was ever actually meant to be a book at all. Nobody's really clear what the purpose of Characters is. Some people think that it's a sort of moral, a moral guideline, which is actually what Theophrastus himself says in the preface, addressing Polycles. He says, "During my 99 years, I've met all varieties of character, and I've subjected good people and bad to minute observation and comparison. And so I thought that I ought to write a book describing how both sorts of person behave in their daily lives. I shall set out for you type by type the different kinds of character which relate to them and how they manage. For I think that our sons will be better, Polycles, if we bequeath them such records as these, which will, if they use them as examples, prompt them to converse and associate with the most decent sort of people, in the hope that they may not fall short of them." So that seems perfectly reasonable. This may be an ethical treatise. But part of the reason that's not entirely convincing is that while the character descriptions that Theophrastus gives us are often not entirely complimentary, there's also no indication of ethical correction here. These are really just character sketches. And again, this is a very Aristotelian thing to me, because Aristotle is big into categorization and sort of identifying types and things like this. So the Characters make sense in that context, but that doesn't really explain the purpose of it. Another idea, and I'm more convinced by this, is that this is in some way connected to the theater, particularly ancient Greek comedy, because in the 4th century, so the century really of Menander more than of Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, and Aristophanes, comedy changed, and comedy became more important as an art form, whereas tragedy kind of not necessarily declined. It certainly didn't decline in popularity, but the 5th century was really the golden age of Greek tragedy. And then as you move into the 4th century, it seems like tragedy, a lot more tragedy, is sort of repetition of the works of the great masters, rather than people writing new things that become like really well regarded. But people like Menander come along with what's called new comedy, and that changes the game. New comedy is much more character-driven than the old comedy of Aristophanes. So it makes a lot of sense that you would have a document that sets out to say, here are the types of people and how they behave. Because that's one of the things that's throughout the Characters, is we get descriptions not just of their sort of ethical nature, but we get descriptions of behavior, of the way that they talk, the kinds of things they say, the way they position themselves, physical descriptions that really make sense if this is a treatise for the theater. Now, that may be either categorizing types that are used in new comedy. New comedy, for those of you who don't really know, like I've done a video on Menander where I talk about new comedy, but you think about it almost like commedia dell'arte, I think. Like, it's very stylized in performance, and it depends on recognizable character types put into particular situations. So that's one possibility, is that here's a catalog of the types of characters that are being used by comedians. This may also be intended as a sort of aid to comedians when they are trying to create particular characters. But again, this is very, very visual in the way that Theophrastus describes these different character types. So that, to me, that leads me to believe that this is probably written at least with the theater in mind. Although one of the other things about Theophrastus is that apparently he was a very engaging and animated lecturer. And so it's also quite possible to imagine him sort of acting out these different characters in the Lyceum. Although it's also not clear that this was ever meant to be a document as a whole. That's the other weird thing about the characters. It's not clear that this was ever meant to be a document as a whole. Some people speculate that this was just sort of random lecture notes or things that Theophrastus composed to entertain his students or his friends or whatever it is. So again, there are a lot of different theories about what this document was meant to do and why. But I think it's a theater thing. That may partially be because I'm a drama person, but to me, the descriptions really lend themselves to performance. So it makes a lot of sense. So I want to read you a characteristic, fairly short description here. This is of the chatterbox. And we've got all different kinds here. We've got like the toady, we've got the dissembler, we've got the penny pincher. So we've got these different types, most of which are relatively negative. But I want to read you this one so you get a feel for how Theophrastus approaches these things. So this is the chatterbox. And it starts in this version that I'm reading, which is from the James Diggle translation. It starts actually with a little bracketed section and ends with a little bracketed section. So I'm not sure, I think that indicates that this is, I'm not sure if this is editorial addition or clarification or what exactly this is. But I think this is actually Theophrastus giving us sort of scaffolding material around the description itself. Okay, no more ado. I will read you the chatterbox. In brackets, chatter is the narration of long and ill-considered speeches. Striking a little too close to home for this YouTuber. The chatterbox is the sort of person who sits next to a complete stranger and first sings his own wife's praises, then recounts the dream he had last night, then describes in every detail what he had for dinner. Then, as things are going well, he continues with talk like this. People nowadays are far less well-behaved than in the old days. Wheat is selling in the market at a bargain price. The city's full of foreigners. The festival of Dionysus heralds the start of the sailing season. More rain would be good for the crops. What land he will cultivate next year? Life is hard. Demopos set up a very large torch at the Mysteries. How many pillars there are in the Odeon? I threw up yesterday. What day of the month it is? The Mysteries are in September. The Apatoria in October, the rural Dionysia in December. If you let him go on, he will never stop. Brackets. Show a clean pair of heels, full steam ahead, avoid such people like the plague. It's hard to be happy with people who don't care whether you are free or busy. So I think this is a really, really good example of the approach that Theophrastus takes to describing the characters. Again, not just do we get the sort of physical description of like, he'll sit down next to a stranger. And some of them are more physical than others. Like we get descriptions of wrestlers or of guys who want to be thought of as great wrestlers who will like twist their butts around. And like that's, I don't know that much about ancient Greek wrestling, but apparently that was the way you signaled that you were a proficient wrestler. But like, this is a particularly interesting description for me because Theophrastus mimics the actual content with the style of the description. Like, this whole core section is one sentence. So from the clause, then as things are going well, he continues with talk like this. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 lines out of maybe 20 lines total for this description, counting the bracketed material. That's just one sentence, just listing the things that the chatterbox will talk about. So it's a matter of form mimicking content because you get sort of overwhelmed with all of the stuff that the chatterbox wants to talk about. The only other one I really want to talk about very briefly is the oligarchic man, because this is an interesting one for me because I work on Greek drama especially and democracy. Athens had a long history of oligarchic attempts to overthrow the democracy. Some successful, some unsuccessful, some supported from outside, some entirely homegrown, etc., etc. But I want to read you the oligarchic man because this was a constant fear among Democrats in Athens. Brackets. Oligarchy would seem to be a policy covetous of power and profit. The oligarchic man is the kind who steps forward when the people are considering whom they will appoint in addition to help the archon with the procession, and gives us his opinion that those appointed should have plenary powers, and says, if others propose 10, 1 is enough, but he must be a real man. The only verse of Homer which he knows is, multiple rule is not good, so let there be one single ruler. And he's completely ignorant of the rest. He's quite liable to say things like, we must meet and discuss this on our own and be rid of the mob and the marketplace, and we must stop courting office and so remove their license to dispense affronts or favors. And it's either us or them, we can't both live in this city. He goes out at midday and struts about dressed in his cloak, with his hair trimmed and his nails carefully pared, declaiming melodramatically, the sycophants make life in the city unbearable. And judicial corruption is a dire affliction. And I cannot imagine why people go into politics. And you must not expect thanks from the common people. They soon forget where the handouts come from. And how ashamed he is when he finds himself sitting in the assembly next to some scrawny fellow who has not used any oil. And he says, compulsory public service and trierarchies will be the death of us. We will never be rid of them. And demagogues are a detestable breed, claiming that Theseus must bear responsibility for the damage they've done to the city. He amalgamated the 12 towns into one, and then the manuscript is incomplete here, and he got what he deserved because he was their first victim. Brackets. And more to the same effect, addressed to foreigners and to citizens of similar disposition and political persuasion. So, much like the contemporary world, the contemporary US and Europe, etc., where democracy is under attack by those who want to institute single person or single party rule. This is one of Theophrastus's negative characters. So